I want to welcome everybody to Storytime with Jim. Whether you're a new viewer, whether you've been here before, just want to say hi. Jim's going to talk a little bit about fathers today. Father's Day was just yesterday. As some of you know, my dad passed away about a year and a half ago. My dad was a pretty big influence in my life. I guess most people's are, whether it's a positive influence or a negative influence. My dad was a positive influence. I tell people he had a camera in my hands at age 5. Probably had a National Geographic in my hands before that. First camera my dad ever had in my hand was a Konica Auto Reflex. It was a shutter priority camera, best I remember. You'd set the shutter speed on the top. There was a little needle inside that would bounce up and down and tell you what the aperture was. At the time, all I knew was as long as I got the needle inside the little window, it would be properly exposed. Later on, my dad would teach me about aperture and depth of field and such things as that. And I would understand that I needed to adjust and get the aperture set at a certain setting so that I could get the depth of field that I wanted. Anyway, there were always National Geographics around the house. So, to me, I had some of the best photography ever as influences and inspiration. My dad was also a big Ansel Adams fan. Now, although I've read Ansel Adams' books on his own, the negative in those books, I will admit, they were completely over my head and still are. I do know the general concept, but for the most part, I just know a good picture has a lot of contrast in blacks and whites. Anyway, back to talking about my dad. I don't remember a time that my dad wasn't hardworking. Even in his later years, when both of his knees had given out, he had some back issues from a car wreck. He was always still packing stuff around, carrying stuff around. The day he died, he was carrying some lasagnas out to the van to take to church for a church dinner. One of the things I remember most about my dad is that he always was kind to other people. I don't think there was ever a time that my dad didn't leave a tip, no matter what the service was like. And one thing for sure, he was going to over-tip. Dad always had a kind word for everyone. He was one of those people that never met a stranger. One of the things that impressed me the most was in the weeks and months after my dad passed, as we would tell people at restaurants, the bank, the pharmacy, and other places about my dad passing. They would say, "We're going to miss him." And they would say, "Oh, he always would talk to us when he was in here." And that was one thing Dad always did do. He always had something to say to everybody and could always find something in common with them to talk about. He was one of those people that was always generous. My dad had money, and we went out to eat, you weren't going to have to pay. I remember one story about a roommate of mine. My dad was talking about a propane tank torch he had bought. It was one of the little, 6, 9-inch tall, small propane tanks with a torch that twisted on the top of it. And he was talking about how they were on sale at a store called Big Lots. My roommate happened to mention that she wished she had one of those that would come in handy for some of the projects she did. Well, later that afternoon, my roommate called me. She was crying. I asked, "What's going on?" And she blubbered your dad. And I said, "Why? What did Dad say to you? What did Dad do?" And she said, "It's not what he said." She said, "But I got home," and she said, "Sitting in my chair over in the corner of the living room was one of those propane tanks I told him I needed." That's the kind of person Dad was. If he knew you needed something and he had the means to get it for you, he was going to. A lot of people would joke around. My dad would go the first of the month, take out his retirement check, put it in a bank envelope, and then he would slide it in his shirt pocket. And then Dad would walk around with a ridiculous amount of money in his shirt pocket for the rest of the month. At the end of the month, when he had a 20 or a 5 left, he would say, well, we're done spending money until next month. I always remember one time our preacher joked. He said they would be working on something at church, and they would say, well, I wish we had this many dollars so that we could go buy whatever tool, whatever screws, whatever wood, or whatever they needed for the project. He said Dad would always just reach in his pocket, pull out some money, and hand it to him. He said he would always just stand there wide open at how much money Dad was just packing around in his shirt pocket. The other thing Dad always packed around in his shirt pocket was his insulin needles. Dad was a diabetic. For a long time he struggled with low blood sugar until they got his insulin regulated and balanced out. So Dad would always carry his insulin in his pocket. We would have birthdays, parties, or just an occasion where maybe there were sweets being handed out. And Dad would always, take a piece of cake, take a drink of whatever was being offered. And people would say, Barney, aren't you diabetic? And he would just pat his shirt pocket and say, yep, but I got my pen with me. It's all good. One of the funnier stories I remember about my dad is one time me and him were driving. And my dad had had some pulmonary embolisms over his life. So one day me and him were driving around, and he started acting funny on me, sort of loopy. Well, I thought it was low blood sugar, so I treated it as such. I took Dad to Denny's. I told the girl, while we're waiting for our seat, could you get me a glass of orange juice? When I realized Dad couldn't even drink out of the orange juice straw, I said, hey, I just need some packets of jelly real quick. Do you get us a seat? This poor 16-year-old hostess is going, do I need to call someone? And I kept saying, nah, we're good. I just need to get some sugar in him. So as my dad would slump her over in a chair, I juiced him up on some orange juice, some jelly packets, got him to eat. We got back in the car, drove some more. He still kept acting loopy. So finally Mom convinced him to go to the emergency room. As they were checking him out in the emergency room, they checked his blood sugar. And I said, well, it was low earlier today. I said, but I tried to treat it with some orange juice and such. And the nurse taking his blood sugar looked at me and said, did you say low? I said, yeah. She said, well, right now it's about 286. And I just sort of bowed my head and said, oops, that's probably my fault. Come to find out, my dad was having a pulmonary embolism. I don't know what you call it, onset or whatever. And so it did have him a little slowed down, a little loopy, and a little lethargic. So what I had treated as low blood sugar wound up being that. The other story about his low blood sugar I always remember. Me and Mom were treating him one day. We were putting honey in his mouth, jelly, trying to get his blood sugar up because we could tell at the house it had gotten low. Well, it was beyond anything we could treat, so we finally called the ambulance. 911 came in. I told him he's on warfarin, he's on this, he's on that, he has high blood pressure, blah, blah, blah. They went through everything. They gave him a glucose IV. And when the lady pulled the needle out, blood shot up about 3-4 feet. No joke, literally shot out of his arm, up into the air. And she goes, oh. And I said, oh yeah. And I maybe forgot to mention to you, he's on blood thinners. So anyway, those are just some of the funny stories I remember about Dad. I do remember he was always there to teach. We were always in either his wood shop or his dark room or whatever it was he was doing. With my niece, he always had a set of Legos or a set of erector set that her and him would build. He was always teaching, always there to listen, and that's pretty much my dad.